For Edgar Allan Poe, the woman is often an object of discovery and a site of projection, found like Ligeia or lost like Lenore, host to implacable, unrequited desire. In his writings, women are absence itself, symbolic of heartbreak, laid out cold by the hour of the tale, from the violated grave of Bernice to Annabel Lee in her tomb by the sounding sea. Poe phrased the line between the necrophilic imposition of the living on the dead and the tradition of courtly love, so far as to declare that there was never a difference between the two. Bernice becomes a perverse mirror to Beatrice, and that distance, from the medieval to the modern, reveals a long history of fault lines in the conception, expression, and representation of romantic love. Poe's Gothic tale, The Fall of the House of Usher, tells of the doom of the Usher lineage, fallen to identical twins Roderick and Madeline. Roderick is a decadent eccentric. Madeline is ill with catalepsy, a condition of trances and seizures and bodily rigidity that will lead her to be mistaken for a corpse and entombed. The fall of the title is first metaphoric. Roderick and Madeline will have no heirs, and then, in a final cataclysm, literal, with the house torn apart by a storm, a climax to Madeline's apparent death and resurrection. In 1928, amateur filmmakers James Sibley Watson and Melville Webber released their adaptation of Poe's story, a 12-minute experimental film heavy with passions and symbols. A thread of formal dynamism runs through Watson and Webber's version, indebted to the prismatic and anamorphic distortions of Dadaist and Surrealist filmmakers, and the harsh geometries of Vorticism. Each of the filmmakers brought a distinctive sensibility to their partnership. Watson, best known as editor of the modernist little magazine The Dial, was caught between a radical modern vision and its splintering of forms, and his own conservative desires for a common culture. Webber, a scholar of medieval art history, had studied the Romanesque frescoes of Tavant, and his set building, makeup, even his suggestion of the source material, descend from a desire to continue the images that he had encountered in the Italian crypts. The partners agreed on The Fall of the House of Usher as source material because, neither having read it in 15 years, they felt they could regard it at a distance. The result is Oneric, a vision of a half-remembered story in which only the archetypal beats and the most striking images remain, complemented by the dynamic embellishments of the artist's own macabre vision. Painted faces, personified top hats, floating coffins, and the impossible architecture of the endlessly expanding house. The stylized distortions of Melville Webber's painted sets invite comparison to those of Robert Vienne's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. The influence of German Expressionism courses through Webber's art direction, in which painted doors occupy distorted angles and backgrounds of flat shadows represent the boundaries of the set and of the world itself. But where Vienne's film relied on a proscenium to contain its distortions, Watson and Webber embrace in-camera optical effects, from the film's kaleidoscopic epigraph to the superimpositions that dominate the scenes of Madeline's trance, to the prismatic abstractions of the finale. They had received special lenses from the optical manufacturer Bosch & Lomb, which allowed them to cast anamorphic distortions, kaleidoscopes, and prisms that echo form across vertical lines, an effect akin to Marcel Duchamp's nude descending a staircase. Early scenes introduce the decadent domestic life of the Usher twins. At a strange dinner where gloved hands, their bodies unseen, fill wine glasses where rotating, canted angles on Madeline's face broadcast her illness. When Madeline leaves the dining table, a trail of floating coffins serves as a transition, and a striking hammer, symbolic of the nailing shut of a coffin, is multiplied to become a cascade of hammers, omens of what is to come. Simultaneous to Madeline's trance, a traveler arrives, played by Melville Webber himself. He is a substitute for the unnamed narrator of Poe's story, here recast as an enigmatic, devilish figure, a catalyst for Madeline's ordeal, his face painted in the style of the frescoes of Tavant. Even his ringing of the doorbell becomes a part of Madeline's trance, with looming bells seen ringing as she passes through the house. The space of the house is increasingly alien, a cavernous pit of darkness met with superimposed steps that seem to climb endlessly. The terror of catalepsy, to be mistaken for dead, to be buried alive, suggests something more frightening than death itself, for it commands the reader to imagine a combination of paralysis and hypnosis, a suspension of agency, a slow walk to a final destination that ends in a scream that cannot be heard. Against this stands the dynamism of the house itself. Jutting at harsh angles like the paintings of Wyndham Lewis, it is a vortex shearing and reshaping the objects with which it comes in contact. In this space, the viewer's eye is under attack, reshaped to accommodate the sudden fractures of the montage and lens distortions that range from the womb eye of anamorphosis to the geometric echo of the prism to the flipped mirrors of the kaleidoscope. Gloved hands pass over the lifeless face of Madeline Usher, closing her eyes and caressing her body. Once she is entombed, Roderick enters his own entranced reverie, the familiar state of Poe's guilty men. As he walks through the house, her hallucinations become his, hammers beating against unseen nails like the beating of a hideous heart. This sequence culminates in Madeline's first reappearance as a wraith that transforms into a stack of books. In Poe's story, Roderick and the narrator together read a fable of a knight battling a dragon, a work of meta-literature that seems to be bleeding into Roderick's reality as Madeline rises from the grave, her efforts at entering the house resonating with the actions of this story. Watson and Webber instead portray the traveler as a menacing trickster who, now with his top hat in place of his face, flips through the pages of books for Roderick, out of which float fractured, reassembling onomatopoeia. Beat, crack, rip. As Madeline returns, she lunges towards Roderick as the traveler escapes, a horrific reunion of the hypochondriac and his corpse-like twin, an eruption of abjection. As Madeline falls into Roderick, the house collapses into the marshes under the light of the moon. The Vorticists imagined the artist in the center of a cyclone, a vortex of energy, as Ezra Pound saw it, where energy cuts into space and imparts form to it. Theirs was a fragmentary space of immense violence. Their dynamism was angular, restless, their geometries carved to hard edges. Watson and Webber claim that same energy in their contrast of the dynamic fearsomeness of the house, its shifting stairs. The house remains restless even in the presence of death, the absolute stasis that catalepsy represents. This dynamic contrast between the stillness of death and the perpetually shifting architecture of the house is at the heart of Watson and Webber's performance of Poe's theme, that necrophilic imposition of the living on the dead, casting into the inanimate a wild spirit. Tensions between the stasis of catalepsy and death and the unrestrained dynamism of the house reflect what H.P. Lovecraft has claimed as the common soul of Roderick, Madeline, and the house, a restless soul hounded by madness, fated to annihilation. Beginning with Lucy Fisher's reevaluation of Watson and Webber in 1987, scholars have revisited their films in the context of their obscurity, meditating on their exclusion and dismissal and the indifference with which they were met. Lisa Cartwright offers the most thorough discussion of their work at its origins. She elaborates on the influence that poets E. E. Cummings and Ezra Pound had on Watson and Webber, Cummings having been an early collaborator of Watson's in the conceptualization of his films, Pound as an ambassador of Vorticism. At the same time, she presents evidence of Watson's conservatism and dogmatic critique of radical modernism. Jan Christopher Horak, writing on Watson's subsequent work in educational and industrial filmmaking, points to the reconciliation of their formal dynamism with the utility of informational cinema. The scholarship surrounding Watson and Webber has a tendency to acknowledge an ideological conflict between the filmmakers and modernism itself, a strange tension as their films seem at once to aspire to the folklore and fables that underpinned Gothic literature and to the geometric violence of modern art. This tension drives their work here, where splintering imagery establishes the film's emotional tenor. Kaleidoscopes, prisms, countless stares, phantasmal anagrams are not political aesthetics for Watson and Webber. They serve instead as the emotional substance of the film, rendering the impossible house absolute in its dynamic mise-en-scène.